Hello, everyone. Welcome to Touch Tank Tuesday. My name is Olivia, and I'm the educator here at the Deep Bay Marine Field Station. We are an education and research facility that is part of Vancouver Island University. So we do a lot of education here. Just like today, we had a fantastic school group in at the station to learn about adaptations and also some of the research we do and some of the critters that are in our touch tank right here. And we also do a ton of research. So most of our research focuses on the local marine environment, as well as shellfish growth, and how to make shellfish grow better in the future. So there's a whole lot going on that kind of has these global applications, which is pretty great. Today we're going to be talking about another critter from our touch tank. This one's going to be a little bit different. This was one that I noticed a few days ago in our touch tank, so kind of excited to talk about it today. We are going to be talking about sea sponges. So a little bit different than what we've talked about, but we found a sponge. There are actually a couple different sponges in our touch tanks that kind of live with the critters there. This one's really interesting because the species that we're going to talk about today is the one that makes these tiny holes in the shells of different bivalves. Oh, there we go, it's focused. So if you can see that there, this is the shell of a rock scallop. And we have a couple of them here. And you can see all these tiny holes, and that is from a sponge. Good afternoon, Lisa. Welcome. So this is from a sponge that lives right here and is actually native to the Pacific Northwest. And so it's one of our native sponges. It is the yellow boring sponge. And it's not called a boring sponge because, well, it's mundane. It's because of what it does. So clearly it bores into the structure of bivalves. So remember, bivalves are really any of those shellfish you see that have two valves, so two shells. That's your bivalve mollusk. And so this is a rock scallop that you could probably find out in the intertidal and subtidal zone. And we have actually my favorite critter here in the touch tank is the rock scallop that we have that really does look like a rock. And we'll talk about it today. So first off, we're going to talk about sponges in general. Get a look of really what sponges are, what exactly they are, because they can be a little bit confusing, just like algae. It's confusing trying to figure out what they are, especially since they don't really look like animals. And then we will talk about the yellow boring sponge and really just our touch tank one that's here. So it'll be pretty cool. If you have any questions, please put them in the comments section and I will do my best to answer them as I go. If I can't answer them, then I will come back to try and answer them later. Okay, so let's get started. So sponges are this big group, this big phylum called Porifera. And if you think about it, porifera, they're basically these porous, so these organisms with holes in them. And everything about them, so their way of life, relies on the fact that they have water rushing through them. So the water goes through the pores and that helps them to live. What they really are just multicellular organisms. So if you think we're multicellular, but they don't have brains, they don't have a nervous system, they don't have eyes or ears or limbs. So they're one of the most simple multicellular organisms that exists. And so really they rely on that water that comes through them because they can't move. And that water goes through these pores and it will do things like take away waste, it'll deposit nutrients. So that's how they're able to survive. So it is an amazing system that they have set up there. And so that's how it really works. And Porifera is that big phylum that has all the organisms in it that have pores and channels within them. And when we talk about sea sponges or just sponges in general, we talk about Porifera, so that big phylum. And I know usually we don't just talk about the big phylum, so we'll talk about an even smaller class, so that small group, the class, that is demospongiae. So really, we just call them demosponges. And demosponges are basically a sponge that has a skeleton. So that skeleton is made out of a calcium carbonate. So just like these shells that have calcium carbonate, demosponges can have the calcium carbonate skeleton in two different forms. So aragonite, which we've talked about before when we talked about shellfish and oysters. So that is sort of the weaker, more dissolvable version of calcium carbonate. And then secondly, they can be made out of calcite, which is that very strong calcium carbonate like this shell here. So it's two forms of the same compound. And so it's that skeleton that's covered in these soft cells that have holes and pores through them to allow water to move through. So they are really complicated yet simple creatures. It's amazing. Their body is very simple, but what we know about them and what scientists know about them is very, very low. Hi, Lori. Welcome. So scientists are constantly studying sponges to really understand them. From what I read, sponges have been around for more than 600 million years. So they have been around for a very, very, very long time. So before the dinosaurs, so a very long time. And so these demosponges, we can look at an even smaller group called Cleona. And Cleona is that small genus, so it's really quite small, of demosponges. So within that group, and that's where we have this native yellow boring sponge that we're going to look at today. The yellow boring sponge is actually kind of exciting because it acts like a parasite. And we'll get a look at it, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a minute. But Cleona, that genus, has about 80 different species, and there are so many different species of sponges as well. So let's go to the touch tank and take a look at the sponge that's there, and also at our rock scallop, and take a look at this. So remember, this is how a bored or a shell that has already been bored looks from a rock scallop. You can see all the tiny little holes there if it would focus. And we're going to go check out what a normal scallop looks like that has not been bored through by a sponge. So here is just a regular, I think this is the Japanese scallop. That's the shell there. It's a different type of scallop, but you can see it has a very like regular shell. It hasn't been bored into. There aren't any holes in it. Okay, so let's go to the touch tank and take a look. And make sure if you have any questions, you ask in the comment section, and I will do my best to answer them. So we're heading over here to the touch tank. And what I've done is, before we started, I put our lovely scallop into a container over here. And that's just so that I actually don't touch the scallop, because once I've already touched the boring sponge, I don't really want to touch our scallop that lives in here. What I'll probably do is take the boring sponge elsewhere afterwards, because the scallop that lives here could be infected by this sponge. So I'm just going to pull up this sponge here for you. So this was a picture that I actually put on Facebook a little bit earlier, but you can take a close-up look at the sponge. So take a look at those yellow spots. Those yellow spots are what we're talking about. That is the yellow boring sponge. And all you can see on the surface are just these yellow spots that can get up to about 3 millimeters in diameter. These ones are a little bit smaller, I think. But what you don't see is inside the shell that this sponge has basically bored through and used acid to drill through the shell and create all of these tunnels and structures within the shell. And they do that to both living and dead bivalves. So in this case, this is a dead shell. This is just the shell of, and you can see it on this side as well. So there's these tiny yellow dots. And so if a bivalve was just living normally in the water, what would happen is that a young yellow sponge, which is a larvae, so it's just floating about, would settle onto the shell. And at that point, it would begin to break away the shell by using acid. So once it has dissolved the shell, it will remove the shell pieces by passing it along its body and out into the water to just get rid of it. And then the boring sponge would continue to drill until it has created basically all of these tunnels within. And what happens with a living scallop, and so this can happen in both scallops and oysters, what happens in a living scallop is that it would drill until it weakened the scallop and it caused there to be holes in it, and eventually the scallop would end up dying. After the scallop died, what would happen is that the boring sponge continues to grow. So it continues to grow and eat away with acid at the shell until it's no more. So it's completely destroyed. So this is a really interesting sponge. Being native, it's kind of cool to see how much damage it does to this shell here and how it's able to survive in the Pacific Northwest. And these sponges reproduce both asexually, so they will break off a piece and start growing a new sponge, or sexually, where they will actually fertilize and create larvae inside the sponge, and then those will be sent out into the water column. And at that point, it would settle on proper material like calcium carbonate, like this structure right here, like a shell. So that's what it ends up doing. And so it's kind of like a parasite in that sense that it ends up hurting the scallop and living off of its structure, which is kind of interesting here. So that is one of the bigger shells that we have here. And what I'll do is show you our rock scallop. So I'll just put that one back here and show you kind of why this rock scallop is pretty much my favorite. Okay, so this is the rock scallop right here. So this rock scallop actually has a white cucumber on it right now, which you should be able to see. So there's the white cucumber that we saw a couple sessions ago. That white cucumber that's what its body looks like, and you were able to see that previously, I believe. But if we look, you can see that this. Oh, awesome. Great. I'm glad, Julie. So you can see this, I'm going to try not to touch it because I don't want to get the sponge if there is anything on it. So this is the rock scallop, and it honestly just looks like a rock. It's absolutely amazing how much it looks like a rock. Ooh. And we also have something that's living on it right now too. I don't know what that is. Interesting. It looks like there are two tentacles that are moving about. But this rock scallop, you can see it's kind of opening its shell right now. So it has a little bit of an opening, and you should be able to see its yellow mantle. And we'll see if we can run it around here. There we go. So that orange part, that is the mantle of the rock scallop. So the mantle is that tissue that when the scallop shell opens, that's where all those cilia are, just like on the oyster. And those are those tiny little tentacles that grow off there. Usually the mantle is the place at which a bivalve secretes its shell. So at least in oysters, that creates the shell, and these ones as well. Oh, hi, Fred and Dolores, welcome. So this scallop is one of my favorites because of how hidden it is, because it absolutely just looks like a rock. I'm going to use my other hand to kind of, oh, there's the mantle there, to pick it up and show it to you here. So this one looks like it's been almost fused with a rock. And it could have at some, ooh, it clapped its shell at us. Watch it go again. It might actually clap its shell at us again. No. Oop, it just sent some water bubbles up at us. But it's amazing that what looks like a rock could actually be an animal. And if you remember these scallops, let me put it to the side like this. Remember, scallops are free swimming. This rock scallop is not really because of how large it is. But most scallops can swim around by clapping their shells. And they also tend to have up to 100 to 200 eyeballs on their mantles. There are these tiny little dots, which you can't really see right now. But they are amazing creatures. And so when the boring sponge gets onto their shell and starts drilling, it ends up weakening them, and they do end up dying over time. But the boring sponge needs somewhere to live as well. So understandable. With the boring sponge, those tiny yellow holes that you saw, or the yellow bubbles, it looks like, those are actually holes to allow waste and water out of the sponge's body. And those are called oscula, which is interesting. What's special about the yellow boring sponge? Well, what's exciting about this boring sponge is that its skeleton is made out of silica rather than some that are made out of calcium carbonate. So this specific one is made out of silica. So it's called kind of a glass sponge. Oh, and you can see the mantle is totally opening up there. And what the scallop is doing is filtering the water to try and get something to eat. And oh, do you see all those tiny, tiny dots at the bottom of the mantle? Along the white part, those are its eyeballs. So there are these tiny blue dots that are its eyeballs. So it can actually see us. And the eyeballs are very, very, very simple though. So they're really just seeing shadows. Not as much as we can see, but they're still quite amazing. And then that white part, remember, is the sea cucumber that's kind of crawling on it. And you can see there are all of these tiny little projections as well coming out. Hopefully you can see it. And those are tentacles that are coming out of the scallop. So they're really, really cool. But yeah, we'll head back over to the table right now. So the boring sponge is a really cool creature, but it is seen as a pest in different types of aquaculture. Here, I'm not sure how prevalent it is in like oyster farming, but I do know that they mostly target scallops here. So, but I can imagine with bivalves that the boring sponge probably doesn't it doesn't have a preference. So it'll go for whatever awesome bivalve calcium carbonate shell it has available. And when it finds that shell, then it starts boring and colonizing it and then killing the animal that lives in it. So I can see that could be kind of a pest or a nuisance for some farmers that are trying to grow different types of bivalves. So it's kind of hard to keep those away. And that's probably something that they look for when they're out on the oyster farm and they're pulling up their stacks of oysters. They are probably they're checking the health of the oysters that they're growing. So if you think about it, one thing they would be looking for is if there's evidence of sponges being grown. And if there is, they probably would get rid of that oyster to make sure it didn't spread to the other bivalves or shellfish that are there. So we also have a couple different other, let me see if I can find it. We have some other sponges in here. And I'll actually show you here. So this is one of our sea snails. Actually, I think this is the Oregon Triton that we had looked at previously. And if you take a look at it there, it has this big orange sponge. So this is an orange sponge. So sometimes they can live for a long time on a creature and not really harm them. So in this case, this snail has been here for a fairly long time. It does not seem to be harmed, but this sponge grows on the outside and might actually go in, like bore into the shell slightly as well, like the other boring sponge, but this one is orange. I'm not sure exactly what species this is of sponge, but it has been on this snail for a fairly long time. But it kind of seems like it's been staying there for a long time, and it seems like it is creating basically a soft shell. So at some point, the shell of the sea snail is not going to be hard anymore, and it's not going to be protecting that snail either. So I can't imagine that it's good for it. Does anyone have any questions before we finish up? Hopefully be able to answer something. But the yellow boring sponge is kind of like a parasite in the way that it colonizes. It colonizes those bivalves, it bores into their shells, and then ends up killing them. But it needs that shell to survive. So, okay, well, if anyone thinks of another question, please do let me know. You can comment afterwards in the chat or the comment section, and I will come back and try to answer your questions. Sponges can live for a really long time if you're thinking about it. I was reading that a sponge could live from 500 to 1,000 years. which is absolutely amazing. So there are certain sponges that are probably living deep in the water that have been around for hundreds upon hundreds of years, which is amazing. Does a sponge have any predators? That's a really good question. I don't know of a predator of a sponge, but you would think they would. I think there would be creatures that use them as homes because they seem to create perfect little habitats, kind of like coral. But I don't know about predators, so I will actually look it up and let you know afterwards because I would be interested to know that too. Sponges aren't something that I'm very familiar with, so I was really excited to learn about them to do this session today. So I will check that out, but they can live for a very, very, very long time. The yellow boring sponge, it lives here, usually subtidally though. So you're not going to see it too much in the intertidal zone on the beach, but it lives a little bit deeper in the subtidal. Michael, thank you. You're welcome. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. If you could please let me know if this time has been working for you. We did change Touch Tank Tuesday to be 2 p.m. Rather than our 12:30 p.m. And that's simply because I was missing too many weeks because we had school kids in. So I didn't want to miss any more weeks. If 2 p.m. works for you, let me know. If you think that there is a better time to do Touch Tank Tuesday, then I am happy to kind of take that into consideration. And I'll try to put maybe a poll out at some point. But let me know in the comments section, and hopefully I will talk to you next time. Great. Good to hear, Michael. Okay, I'll see you next time. Bye.